A desperate gamble from Carthage, a decapitated regime, a world on fire. When Heraclius seized the throne, he didn't just inherit a crown, he inherited a suicide mission against the unstoppable Sassanid advance, witnessed a brutal transformation of the Byzantine state as one leader fought to save an empire that everyone else had already buried. Constantinople in the last years of Phocas is a city that listens to its own footsteps. The sea walls still gleam with imperial certainty, but inside the capital the air is heavy with accusation. Courtiers lower their eyes. Senators learn to measure each sentence like a confession. In the hippodrome, the factions, blues and greens, do not merely chant, they threaten. Power has narrowed into a single, frightened body at the center of the palace, and that body is surrounded by knives. The conventional story begins with a simple moral. Phocas was a butcher, and Heraclius was the savior. There is truth in the outline. Phocas came to power by mutiny in 602, when the Danube army rejected Emperor Maurice. What follows in the sources is a grim rhythm of purges, executions of Maurice and his sons, then the slow widening circle of suspected disloyalty. The Chronicon Pasquale and later chroniclers depict a reign soaked in blood and improvisation, yet even that explanation is too easy. Terror alone does not kill an empire. The more dangerous thing is paralysis. Institutions that stop obeying because they no longer believe obedience will be rewarded. Across the water, in Ctesiphon, the Persian king Khosrow II finds the perfect pretext. He had been restored to his throne with Maurice's help years earlier. Now he announces he will avenge his murdered benefactor, and his armies begin to move with a confidence that suggests they have been waiting for this moment. Roman field commanders on the eastern frontier send pleas for money, for replacements, for coherent orders. What returns from Constantinople is suspicion, delay, and too often silence. The Danube frontier collapses like a rotted beam. Slavic groups and Avar forces press south. Cities that once lived behind the assumption of Roman protection begin to bargain for their own survival. Roads that carried tax and recruits toward the capital now carry refugees away from it. The imperial treasury, strained by war and mismanagement, can no longer buy time. Every crisis turns into a referendum on legitimacy, and legitimacy is precisely what Phocas cannot manufacture. In that vacuum, politics becomes theology, and theology becomes a weapon. The empire is still Roman in law and ritual, but it is also a Christian commonwealth that expects the emperor to be God's steward. Phocas tries to seal himself with piety, public ceremonies, a posture of orthodoxy, yet the eastern provinces are torn by Christological disputes and local loyalties. What the central government needs is trust. What it produces is fear. Then the Persians begin taking not just forts, but the world's sense of order. In 610, they are already deep in Roman territory. Within a few years, they will seize Damascus. In 614, they will take Jerusalem. The sources linger on it, the churches violated, the relics seized, the true cross carried off like a trophy. Whether every detail is exact matters less than the strategic consequence. Rome's sacred geography is being dismantled, piece by piece, and the capital can do nothing but watch the iconography of its power march eastward under Persian guard. It is here, far from the palace, that a second center of gravity hardens into resolve. Carthage is not merely a city, it is the throat of the empire. Africa feeds Constantinople. Grain ships are as crucial as armies. The Exarch of Africa, the elder Heraclius, sits at the edge of the Mediterranean with ships, money, and a provincial machine intact enough to act. He also sits with a fact that cannot be argued away. If the capital is strangled, it will have to change. The elder Heraclius does not begin with an army, he begins with a lever. The African administration interrupts the grain supply. It is a rebellion executed with ledger books and harbor chains, not with banners. Phocas may control the palace, but he cannot eat the palace. In the capital, scarcity becomes politics. Every empty market stall whispers that God has withdrawn his favor. Every sailor who does not arrive is another vote against the regime. The younger Heraclius, son of the Exarch, is given the part that history remembers, The voyage for the crown. The Mediterranean crossing is not an epic procession, it is a moving target. The rebel fleet is still a fleet marked for annihilation if loyal forces catch it at sea. Yet the capital's naval defenses are uncertain. And uncertainty is the hallmark of Phocas's rule when Heraclius' ships appear. They do not crash against the walls. They are received by a city already leaning toward betrayal. Inside Constantinople, the factions shift like weather. The Greens, long alienated from Phocas, become conduits for insurrection. Elites who survived by silence now discover principles. The palace guards weigh the odds, and the odds no longer belong to the man on the throne. The sources describe a regime coming apart at the seams. Orders issued and ignored, threats made and laughed at, a ruler isolated in his own ceremonies. Phocas is seized. The scene in the telling is brutal and theatrical. The usurper dragged before the new claimant, insult traded for insult, then execution. Later writers savor the line attributed to Heraclius. Is it thus that you have ruled? And Phocas' bitter reply, and will you rule? Better. Whether the exchange occurred exactly as quoted is less important than why it endures. It is the question that hangs over the moment like smoke, because once Phocas is dead, the empire does not suddenly recover. It reveals in full light how close it is to extinction. Heraclius is crowned in 610, but he takes a throne that no longer commands its map. The Persians advance with a methodical cruelty. The army, once an institution with habits of obedience, has been hollowed by purges, defeat, and unpaid service. Provinces are drifting away, not through formal secession, but through exhaustion. Local leaders making local arrangements because Constantinople cannot protect them. In the west and north, Avars and Slavs threaten the Balkans. In the east, Persian generals operate as if they are dividing an inheritance. For a time, even Heraclius seems to consider the unthinkable. Some sources suggest he contemplated moving the capital to Carthage, away from the vulnerable Bosporus, closer to a functioning tax base. Historians argue about this. Was it a real plan or a rhetorical threat meant to frighten Constantinople's elites into sacrifice? The very existence of the story is revealing. It tells what the moment felt like an imperial center considering flight, as if Rome itself could be packed into ships and relocated. If the conventional story makes Heraclius a soldier emperor who simply marches east and wins, the unstable truth is that he first has to rebuild the state's capacity to exist. That means money, it means coercion, it means bargaining with institutions that hold legitimacy. Here the patriarch Sergius emerges not as a background cleric, but as a partner in survival. When the treasury is empty, sacred wealth becomes fiscal policy. Church plate and treasures are gathered, some willingly, some under pressure, and transformed into coin, pay, and equipment. Piety becomes liquidity. This is not a clean transaction. It is a political gamble, converting the church's visible wealth into the army's visible presence, wagering that the people will accept sacrilege in exchange for protection. The state's ideology begins to shift under the strain. The emperor is no longer just the administrator of God's order. He becomes the champion of an embattled Christian people, a man whose body must move where the danger is. Because paper edicts no longer move anyone, Heraclius leaves the capital and takes the field. That decision is its own revolution. For centuries, emperors had led campaigns, but the machinery of late Roman governance had also produced rulers who could remain in the palace and still project power. Heraclius cannot. The empire has become too fragile to be commanded from behind curtains. He trains with troops, shares hardship, and tries to forge loyalty out of proximity. The army he needs is not simply large. It must be bound to him personally, because the state's old guarantees have eroded. The military transformation that follows is debated in modern scholarship. Later Byzantine themes, military districts settling soldiers on land, are sometimes projected backward onto Heraclius as a deliberate architect. Others argue the changes were more improvised, emergency measures, ad hoc allocations, and regional commands hardening only later into a system. What is not debated is the visible effect. The empire becomes more compact, more militarized, more dependent on local resilience. It is an organism cauterizing its wounds to stop the bleeding. Meanwhile, the Persians continue their harvest. Egypt, granary of the empire, falls in 619. Grain is no longer merely a lever used by rebels. It is a strategic loss that starves the capital's future. Syria is gone. The Holy Land is gone. The true cross is gone. Each loss is a strike not only against territory, but against meaning. An empire that defined itself as the guardian of Christian order watches its sacred spaces become enemy provinces. Heraclius answers with propaganda that is not mere theater, but psychological mobilization. War is reframed as sacred duty. The enemy is cast not simply as a rival empire, but as an affront to God's favor. The language intensifies. Sermons, processions, and iconography braid together into a single message: survival is salvation. Some historians treat this as cynical manipulation. Others see a genuine transformation in political theology, a moment when the state's identity tightens around faith because the older Roman universality is slipping away. Either way, it works, because desperation makes meaning a weapon. Then comes the moment when the world narrows to the walls of Constantinople. In 626, while Heraclius is campaigning far from the capital, the Avars and Slavs appear before the city in force, coordinating with Persian units on the opposite shore. It is a siege staged across water. The Persians cannot cross easily. The Avars cannot breach the Theodosian walls quickly. But together they can try to starve the city, to break its nerve, to prove that God has abandoned it. The city becomes a drum. The sea is filled with boats, the air with shouted commands, the walls with the scrape of men hauling stones. Sergius carries icons in procession along the ramparts, a moving line of sacred images against a horizon of enemy fires. The defense is not only military, it is spiritual theater as morale maintenance. The attackers launch assaults. The defenders answer with missiles and prayer. The imperial government, so recently a machine of terror under Phocas, now survives by persuading its people that endurance is holy. The siege fails. Storms, naval resistance, and the stubborn geometry of Constantinople's defenses break the assault. The Avars withdraw, the Persians remain stranded on the far shore, close enough to watch, too far to finish the kill. The consequence is immediate and irreversible. Heraclius has bought time, and time is the only currency that can be spent into victory. He spends it not by defending what remains, but by striking where the Persians do not expect an emperor to strike. Heraclius chooses the offensive into the Caucasus and beyond, maneuvering through harsh terrain to threaten the Persian heartland. It is a campaign of risk layered upon risk, long supply lines, unreliable allies, winter marches. Yet it targets something decisive: the Persian state's confidence that it can keep conquering without paying the price in its own blood and soil. Alliances shift in the cold. The Guk-Turks, often called Khazars in later contexts, enter the calculus as potential partners against Persia. Diplomacy becomes battlefield maneuver. Heraclius is not only fighting generals, he is playing the political geography of Eurasia, trying to make Persia feel encircled while his own empire still limps. In 627, near Nineveh, the war reaches a violent clarity. The accounts differ in detail. Medieval narratives like to place emperors and kings in personal combat, and historians sift these claims with caution. But the strategic reality is solid. Heraclius forces a major battle deep in enemy territory and wins. The Persian army is beaten. A path opens toward the royal residences. It is not simply a tactical victory, it is a psychological shattering. The aura of Persian inevitability cracks. Persia, like Rome, is a system held together by legitimacy. When Khosrow II can no longer deliver victory, his court turns on him. He is overthrown and killed. The empire that had marched so far west now convulses inward. In the chain reaction of decisions, Heraclius's gamble has triggered a collapse inside his enemy's palace, similar to the one he exploited in his own. Peace follows, but it is peace with the taste of ashes. The true cross is returned. In 630, Heraclius enters Jerusalem in a ceremony heavy with symbolism, an emperor carrying back what was taken, as if history itself has been reversed. Chroniclers and later tradition treat it as a triumphant climax. Yet, the streets of the recovered provinces do not magically refill with the old prosperity. Years of occupation have changed property, loyalties, and demographics. Whole regions are exhausted. The imperial administration returns to cities that have learned to survive without it. Here, the story becomes unstable again, because victory reveals the cost of survival. Heraclius has saved the empire by transforming it into something narrower and harder. Latin titles begin to fade in official use. Greek becomes more dominant in governance and military command. The emperor is increasingly Basilius, not Augustus. The The empire is still Roman in law and self-conception, but its center of gravity has shifted. It is becoming what later centuries will call Byzantine, not by sudden invention, but by the slow pressure of catastrophe forcing adaptation. And then, almost immediately, the horizon changes. The Roman and Persian empires have spent themselves in a generation-long struggle. Garrisons are thin, treasuries are strained, populations are war-weary, and sometimes alienated by heavy taxation and doctrinal disputes. In the deserts to the south, a new force is consolidating under the banner of Islam. Within a few years, armies will surge into Syria and Palestine, lands only recently recovered, then into Egypt, then beyond. The victory Heraclius won against Persia will not secure the world he fought for. This is not a moral verdict on his reign. It is the broader historical perspective that his story demands. Heraclius overthrows Phocas and rescues the state from immediate annihilation. But the rescue requires measures that permanently alter what the state is. He turns an empire of inherited administrative confidence into a war-forged polity with a sharper religious identity and a more militarized structure. He defeats a superpower and returns the empire's most precious relic, yet he presides over the exhaustion that makes the next crisis unstoppable. In the end, Heraclius is neither simply savior nor simply harbinger. He is the hinge between worlds, the last Roman emperor to fight a classic imperial war across vast frontiers, and the first ruler of a transformed medieval state that will endure by different rules. The chain reaction begins with grain ships withheld in Carthage and a usurper dragged from a throne, and it ends with two ancient empires drained to the bone, alive but altered, while a new order gathers speed just beyond their exhausted borders. Welcome to the Epic History Tales channel. Subscribe to the channel if you want to watch the similar video